Dr. Eleanor Marsh had always known this day would come. For 40 years, she had kept the impossible secret, hidden away in the sprawling Montana wilderness, where prying eyes rarely ventured and questions went unasked. But as she watched the black SUVs wind their way up the mountain road through her security cameras, kicking up clouds of dust that glowed amber in the early dawn light, she felt her carefully constructed world begin to crumble like ancient sediment under geological pressure. The FBI had finally found her. More importantly, more catastrophically, they had found Blue. The Velociraptor stirred in the massive climate-controlled enclosure that had been Eleanor's life's work, a facility that would have made any major zoo envious with its sophisticated environmental systems, its carefully balanced ecosystem, its attention to every detail of prehistoric habitat recreation. At 68 years old, Blue was an anomaly that defied everything science thought it knew about dinosaur longevity, about reptilian aging, about the very limits of biological possibility. Then again, Blue had defied everything from the moment Eleanor had discovered the egg in that remote Mongolian cave system back in 1985, preserved in conditions so extraordinary, so impossibly perfect, that the embryo inside had somehow remained viable for 65 million years, suspended in a state between life and death that Eleanor still did not fully understand, despite 4 decades of study. Eleanor had been a brash 32-year-old paleontologist then, hungry for discovery, and convinced she could incubate the egg using cutting-edge technology that was primitive by today's standards, but revolutionary for its time. She had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams and simultaneously created her greatest nightmare, a responsibility that would consume every day of the next 40 years of her life. Blue clicked softly from within the enclosure. A sound Eleanor had learned through thousands of hours of observation meant curiosity mixed with concern, a vocalization that carried complex emotional information that most people would never recognize as communication. The raptor could sense her anxiety with an acuity that sometimes frightened Eleanor, reading body language and pheromones with predatory precision honed by millions of years of evolution. After 4 decades together, they had developed a bond that transcended species barriers, a connection built on trust, respect, and countless hours of careful observation and interaction that had taught Eleanor more about animal cognition than any academic study ever could. Blue was not a pet, and Eleanor had never made that fundamental mistake. Blue was a thinking, feeling creature, with her own distinct personality, her own preferences and dislikes, her own way of perceiving and interpreting the world around her. She was also a predator of remarkable intelligence, standing nearly 6 feet tall at the hip with sickle-shaped claws on her feet that could disembowel a full-grown elk in seconds, weapons evolved for efficiency and lethality. Eleanor had witnessed such hunts in the secure 1,000-acre preserve she had built over decades, funded by patents from her legitimate research into prehistoric biology and careful investments that had grown exponentially as technology stocks soared through the 90s and beyond. The SUVs stopped in front of the reinforced gate, their engines idling with mechanical patience. Eleanor counted 6 vehicles, which meant at least 24 agents, possibly more if they had brought specialists. They had come prepared for resistance, for confrontation, perhaps for danger. Through the intercom mounted by her front door, a male voice crackled to life, professional and firm, but not yet threatening. Special Agent Marcus Webb identified himself with bureaucratic precision and requested that Dr. Marsh open the gate and surrender herself peacefully. There was a warrant for her arrest on charges, including illegal possession of endangered species, violation of the Endangered Species Act, unauthorized genetic research, and about a dozen other federal statutes that Eleanor found grimly amusing considering the species in question had been extinct for 65 million years before she brought it back from the edge of permanent oblivion. Helena had prepared for this moment with the thoroughness that characterized everything she did, but preparation and acceptance were entirely different things. She moved through her home with deliberate slowness, a comfortable log structure that belied the sophisticated high-tech laboratory and veterinary facility, hidden beneath it like an iceberg's submerged mass. The walls were covered with photographs documenting Blue's life from hatchling to adult, a visual biography that told the story Eleanor could never publish. There was Blue at 6 months, already showing the distinctive blue-gray coloring that had inspired her name, her eyes bright with juvenile curiosity. Blue at 5 years, making her first successful hunt on a deer that had wandered into the preserve, displaying the predatory instincts that were hardwired into her genetic code. Blue at 20, showing none of the signs of aging that should have appeared according to every model of reptilian longevity, remaining vital and strong. Blue at 40, still healthy and active, suggesting that whatever extraordinary conditions had preserved, that egg had also granted unusual longevity to the creature that hatched from it. Eleanor had published papers theorizing about dinosaur aging and metabolism, carefully avoiding any mention of the living proof sleeping in the enclosure beneath her basement, contributing to scientific knowledge while hiding the most significant discovery in paleontological history. She pressed the intercom button with a finger that trembled slightly despite her efforts at control. She told Agent Webb that she would cooperate fully, but needed 30 minutes to secure her research animals and ensure their safety during the transition. There was a pause filled with radio static. Then Webb agreed, but warned in a tone that suggested he had dealt with delaying tactics before that any attempt to destroy evidence would result in additional federal charges. Eleanor almost laughed at the absurdity. What evidence could she possibly destroy? Blue herself was the evidence, 68 years old and very much alive, 17 feet long from snout to tail, weighing nearly 400 pounds of muscle and bone and intelligence. In the enclosure, Blue paced with increasing agitation, her movements becoming more rapid and jerky. She knew something was profoundly wrong, could read Eleanor's stress in ways that years of study had only begun to explain. Eleanor entered through the sophisticated airlock system she had designed to prevent escapes, and immediately Blue approached with urgent purpose, lowering her massive head in the gesture that Eleanor had learned decades ago meant she wanted reassurance and comfort. Eleanor placed her weathered hand on the raptor's snout, feeling the warm, dry scales beneath her palm, scales that were neither reptilian nor avian, but something uniquely dinosaurian. Blue's eyes, golden and remarkably expressive, in ways that still surprised Eleanor after 40 years, fixed on hers with an intensity that conveyed understanding, if not language. Eleanor had spent decades studying those eyes, documenting the intelligence behind them in journals that would now be seized as evidence. Blue could solve complex spatial puzzles that stumped dogs and rivaled primates, communicate through a sophisticated system of vocalizations and body language that Eleanor had only partially decoded, and even demonstrated what Eleanor firmly believed was a sense of humor, playing tricks and games that seemed designed purely for entertainment. She mourned, too, with an emotional depth that had shattered Eleanor's early assumptions about dinosaur cognition. Eleanor had witnessed Blue's profound grief when her mate Red had died 15 years ago from a congenital heart defect that Eleanor's veterinary skills had been unable to cure despite months of desperate effort. Eleanor had never bred Blue, though she had successfully incubated Red from a second egg, found in the same remarkable cave system during a return expedition in 1987. The decision to prevent reproduction had been deliberate and agonizing. 2 Velociraptors were a secret she could maintain with careful planning and substantial resources. A breeding population would have been impossible to contain, both physically and ethically, creating responsibilities that extended beyond Eleanor's lifetime and capabilities. She had made peace with the fact that when Blue and Red died, that would be the end of this extraordinary chapter in natural history. Except Blue had not died. Neither had Red, until that heart defect took him suddenly at age 53. Both had lived far longer than any reptile of comparable size should have lived according to established biological models, suggesting something extraordinary about their physiology that Eleanor suspected was related to whatever had preserved them in stasis for millions of years. The 30 minutes passed with cruel speed. Eleanor administered a mild sedative to Blue, something to keep her calm when strangers with unfamiliar scents and threatening energy arrived in her territory. She locked down the enclosure's primary systems and activated the automated feeding and climate controls that would maintain proper conditions for at least 72 hours. Then she climbed the stairs to face her fate, each step feeling heavier than the last, weighted with 40 years of secrecy and dedication. She had known this was illegal from the beginning. She had known the risks she was taking with every decision to continue. But she had also known with absolute certainty that revealing Blue's existence prematurely would have resulted in her being seized by governments or corporations, turned into a weapon or a curiosity or both, dissected and studied by people who would never understand what Eleanor had learned over 4 decades of coexistence, who would see only a valuable specimen rather than a living, thinking being. Special Agent Webb was younger than Eleanor expected, maybe 45, with sharp eyes that assessed everything and missed nothing, the gaze of someone trained to spot deception. He was coldly professional as he read her rights from a card he clearly did not need, his team securing the property with military precision that suggested special training. When he asked about the underground facility that their ground-penetrating radar had detected, Eleanor provided the access codes without resistance, knowing that cooperation might earn consideration later. She watched their faces as they descended into her life's work, saw the exact moment when professional skepticism gave way to shock as they encountered Blue for the first time, their training momentarily forgotten in the face of impossibility made flesh. Blue, sedated but conscious and alert, regarded the strangers with wary intelligence, her body language tense and prepared for threat. One young agent reached instinctively for his weapon, and Eleanor's voice cut through the tension like a surgical blade. She told them in a tone that brooked no argument that Blue had never harmed a human being in 68 years, that she was not naturally aggressive unless directly threatened, and that pointing guns at a frightened apex predator was the surest way to provoke exactly the attack they feared. Webb ordered weapons lowered with a sharp gesture, though Eleanor noticed several agents kept their hands near their holsters, ready for violence. The next hours dissolved into controlled chaos. More vehicles arrived in a steady stream, including representatives from the Department of Interior, the Department of Agriculture, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and eventually, inevitably, the Pentagon. Everyone wanted to see the impossible dinosaur living beneath a Montana mountain, wanted to verify with their own eyes that this was not some elaborate hoax. Eleanor answered their questions with mechanical precision, providing documentation she had meticulously maintained over 4 decades, knowing this moment would eventually come. Every veterinary visit she had conducted, every measurement of growth and health, every behavioral observation had been recorded in detailed journals. She had always known this data would eventually be seized, and she had prepared her records accordingly, creating a scientific legacy even as she committed federal crimes. What she had not prepared for, what she could not have anticipated, was the immediate and heated debate over Blue's fate. The scientific community, represented by increasingly excited researchers, wanted her transferred immediately to a research facility where she could be studied properly. The military, represented by stern officers in dress uniforms, saw potential weapons applications in studying an apex predator that had survived extinction and might offer insights into genetic enhancement. Animal rights groups, once news of Blue's existence leaked within hours to a media hungry for sensation, argued passionately that she should be kept in conditions as close to her natural habitat as possible, though they disagreed fundamentally among themselves on what that meant for a Cretaceous predator existing in the 21st century. The government representatives simply wanted to contain what they viewed as a potential threat to public safety, their primary concern being liability and control. Eleanor was formally arrested and processed, then released on bail within 48 hours, thanks to expensive lawyers funded by her substantial assets. But she was forbidden by court order from returning to her property or having any contact whatsoever with Blue, a separation that felt like amputation. For the first time in 40 years, Eleanor and Blue were apart, divided by legal barriers and institutional bureaucracy. Eleanor moved into a hotel in Billings and waited with growing desperation while committees and agencies fought over jurisdiction and next steps, each claiming authority over different aspects of the situation. She watched news coverage that veered wildly between sensationalism and genuine scientific fascination. The world now knew that dinosaurs could be brought back from extinction, that one had been living secretly for decades, that everything they thought they knew about paleontology might need revision. The implications were staggering and terrifying in equal measure. 3 weeks after the raid, Eleanor received an unexpected visitor at her hotel. Dr. Sarah Chen was a paleobiologist Eleanor had mentored briefly 30 years ago, before Eleanor had withdrawn almost completely from academic life to focus entirely on Blue's care and study. Sarah now worked for a private research institute that had been awarded temporary custody of Blue pending the resolution of Eleanor's criminal case. Sarah had a proposal that she presented with urgent conviction. She believed Eleanor should be allowed supervised access to Blue, arguing persuasively that separating them was not only cruel to both woman and dinosaur, but scientifically counterproductive, and that Eleanor's 4 decades of expertise was invaluable, perhaps irreplaceable for Blue's continued care and welfare. The proposal met fierce resistance from multiple quarters, each with their own agenda and concerns. But Sarah was persistent and politically well-connected, leveraging relationships and calling in favors. She argued in meetings and in media interviews that Blue was not just a scientific curiosity or a biological specimen, but a sentient being who had formed a profound interspecies bond with her caretaker over 4 decades. Separating them without compelling cause was inhumane by any reasonable ethical standard. Moreover, Sarah pointed out with clinical precision, Blue had stopped eating entirely, a hunger strike that was beginning to worry the scientists now responsible for her care and survival. She refused food from anyone else, becoming increasingly agitated and distressed, despite the partially familiar environment that had been recreated in her new temporary facility using Eleanor's detailed specifications. 6 weeks after the raid, Eleanor was finally allowed to visit Blue under conditions of heavy supervision. The moment Eleanor entered the enclosure, Blue's behavior transformed dramatically. The raptor rushed forward with a vocalization Eleanor recognized instantly as joy mixed with relief, pressing her massive head against Eleanor's chest in a gesture of affection that made several security personnel reach reflexively for their weapons in alarm. Eleanor wrapped her arms around Blue's muscular neck, feeling the powerful muscles beneath the scales, and for a moment, the entire world consisted of nothing but this reunion, this confirmation that their bond had survived separation. Blue began eating again that very day, accepting food with evident relief. Over the following weeks, Eleanor's carefully supervised visits became routine, a schedule that brought structure back to both their lives. The legal battle over her fate continued with grinding slowness through the federal court system, with prosecutors pushing for significant prison time, while defense attorneys argued that Eleanor had committed her crimes in the service of scientific advancement, that she had maintained Blue humanely and responsibly, and that she had ultimately harmed no one through her actions. The question of what to do with Blue remained frustratingly unresolved, paralyzed by competing interests. She could not be released into any wild ecosystem. No modern environment could safely accommodate a Velociraptor without catastrophic ecological consequences. She could not be destroyed. Too many people now saw her as a living treasure, a bridge to a lost world that deserved protection and study. The trial, when it finally came 8 months later, was a media circus that dominated news cycles. Eleanor pleaded guilty to several charges in exchange for reduced sentencing and a formal role in determining Blue's future care and living conditions. The judge, clearly grappling with unprecedented legal and ethical circumstances, sentenced Eleanor to 5 years probation and extensive community service involving education about extinct species and paleontology. The judge also granted Eleanor's passionate request to continue caring for Blue at a new facility, being constructed specifically for this purpose, funded by a complex combination of government grants and private donations. The new facility was an imperfect compromise, a place where Blue could live out her remaining years in relative comfort, while scientists studied her with Eleanor's guidance and expertise. It was not the isolated mountain sanctuary Eleanor had built with her own resources and vision, but it was infinitely better than the alternatives that had been proposed. Eleanor would live on site in provided housing, monitored by security, but allowed to continue the work that had defined her entire adult life. She would also help train a new generation of researchers in the care and understanding of prehistoric life, sharing her hard-won knowledge in case science ever succeeded in bringing back other extinct species through advancing genetic technology. On the day they transferred Blue to her new permanent home, Eleanor rode in the specialized transport vehicle, her weathered hand resting on Blue's flank as the raptor dozed under sedation for the journey. She thought about the frightened young paleontologist who had incubated an impossible egg 4 decades ago in a makeshift laboratory, driven by curiosity and ambition and wonder. She thought about the years of secrecy, the constant gnawing fear of discovery, balanced precariously against the profound joy of witnessing something no other human had ever seen or would see again. She thought about the cost of her choices and tried to measure it against the value of what she had learned about intelligence, about consciousness, about the boundaries between species. Blue stirred as the sedative wore off gradually, golden eyes opening slowly to focus on Eleanor's face with evident recognition and trust. Eleanor smiled despite everything, running her hand along the familiar contours of the raptor's jaw. She told Blue softly that they were going home, even though it was not the home they had built and known together. But they would be together, and perhaps after everything that had happened, that was enough. After 40 years of shared existence, Eleanor understood with absolute clarity that Blue was not her possession or her pet or her creation. Blue was her companion, her life's work, and her greatest teacher about the nature of life itself. Whatever came next in this new chapter, they would face it together, as they always had through 4 decades of extraordinary coexistence. The transport pulled through the gates of the new facility as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold that reminded Eleanor of that morning when the SUVs had come. Eleanor helped Blue navigate the transfer to her new enclosure, a space that would never fully replace what they had lost, but represented a future they could build together with effort and patience. Scientists waited eagerly to begin their work, excited to learn from both dinosaur and keeper. Eleanor knew the questions would never end. The scrutiny would be constant and sometimes invasive, and her privacy was gone forever, sacrificed to her choices. But as Blue settled cautiously into her new space and turned to Eleanor with that familiar slight tilt of her head that meant trust and affection, Eleanor felt something unexpected rise in her chest. Not quite peace, which seemed too strong a word for her complicated emotions, but perhaps acceptance of circumstances she could not change. She had spent 40 years hiding from the world to protect Blue from exploitation and harm. Now she would spend however many years remain teaching the world why Blue deserved protection and respect as a living being. It was a different kind of mission, requiring different skills and a different kind of courage, but it was one Eleanor could embrace with the same dedication she had brought to everything else. The age of secrets was over, ended by federal agents and legal proceedings. The age of understanding, she hoped with cautious optimism, was just beginning for both of them.